The world of print media has been ever-evolving since its inception in the 15th century. Woodblock printing gave way to the Gutenberg press, which gave way to the Rotary press, which gave way to the internet. In just the last few decades, online media has catalyzed the largest change in the discourse of our public literacy since the very invention of mass printing. Globalization has given us the ability to share ideas with each other at lightspeed, to do art or literature or business in seamless collaboration, and to form meaningful relationships with people we've never even met face to face. In all of these interactions, there's language, there's writing. How we communicate with each other is fundamentally altered by the technology available to us at a certain time in our history. Our relationship to language is in part our relationship to our devices, but as the tech industry rolls out each yearly update and each new generation of mechanisms, it becomes harder and harder to keep up with the constant onslaught of technological evolution. That is precisely why we need people like Dr. Colleen Reilly. Since the beginning of her academic career, she's been examining this strange relationship between man, machine, and language. She's been thinking about how we can best utilize these writing tools that are available to us, and how to better implement them into our classrooms, our routines, and our lives. She's been wondering, how are these tools that we're utilizing shaping us, and how are we shaping them? From Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, you're listening to the Relevate Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Charles Wright. Let's begin, shall we? Dr. Reilly, thank you for being here.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
As I mentioned in the intro, your research mainly focuses on humanity's relationship with technology and how it shapes the way that we learn, teach, and write. What initially drew you to this specific area?
When I began teaching technical writing in 1992 at Purdue University, I was asked to teach with technologies from the beginning. We had rudimentary computer classrooms, and everything was quite difficult to accomplish. Giving students assignments was difficult. Getting students to submit assignments. We did it sometimes through email. We did it sometimes through internal folders. But we were challenged all the time to ask our students to use technologies in that classroom in more and more inventive ways. And so my interest was shaped alongside my teaching from the very beginning.
You have seen the changes in technology and the rise in power of the internet and how that has changed the way that the universities approach teaching English. Can you speak to sort of that change that has occurred over the last 2 decades?
Yeah, it's a change and it isn't. So many things are still the same in that, people are asked to generate text. They may use different tools for generating text. They may use different kinds of visual media to supplement their textual productions, but they're still trying to communicate ideas from one person to another. The internet allowed people to maybe have alternate tools that weren't available before and to reach larger audiences. We often don't differentiate correctly either between the internet and the web. So the internet's been around for since the 1940s, 50s, 60s, right? The web is what happened in the 90s that really made the internet accessible to a multitude of people that didn't have access before. So even when I began at Purdue in 1990, only people at major research institutions had access to email on a scale, right?
Yeah, wow.
So you had to be affiliated with some sort of organization to get an email. Later, you could pay, someone like AOL or something like that and get a disk and get email. But this was not just something that everybody got. And because I was at Purdue, we had that kind of access. Purdue allowed me to have access to things way before the general population had access. So we were using the web. I was asking students to make websites, for example, for clients in the community starting in 1996. So this is before most people even knew that they had access to the web and what the web could do for them. So alongside of that, we had to kind of change how we thought about what sorts of products students would submit for our classes. And while they were still, like I said, people communicating ideas from one person to another, they had different layers that incorporated the technology. So we had to teach people how to do rudimentary coding. We had to teach them then, if you were going to publish a website, you actually had to run commands on it to make it readable and accessible to the population. So there was a lot more going on that we were teaching that wasn't actual textual production or even graphic production, but was like coding and markup and other kinds of behind the scenes writing that supports what you're seeing in front of you as you use a text in, an interface or something like that.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting to think about where that started and how we've gotten to the point now where, especially during the pandemic, education basically couldn't have happened without technology and without the internet. We were so reliant on Canvas and Zoom. And even then, that is stuck around. We still use Canvas. Canvas is the backbone of how the university runs their classes now. It's really interesting to see the complete polar shift.
And that was supposed to have happened even before the pandemic. I spent a long time from 2015 to about 2023 in the Center for Teaching Excellence. And one of the things that we would hold a course design institute every summer, and one of the things that we would tell to our participants who were faculty, part-time faculty, full-time faculty, tenured, non-tenured, all faculty, we would tell them that, Canvas should be the center of your course. But getting everyone to do that was difficult. And as you're saying, the pandemic made that essential. Mm-hmm. But it was something that we wanted for everyone before the pandemic happened, because that makes the material accessible to students in the most broad-based way, where students always know that if they've forgotten something or if they need to look at something again that happened in class or that is related to an assignment, they know that they have space to go to get that information. Every student should have that. Yeah. And every student in each course should have that.
Yeah. You describe yourself as someone who's interested in multimodal composition and pedagogy. And I was going to ask you how you incorporate those technologies into your classrooms, but you basically just answered that question. But so I'm going to alter the question a little bit and say, how do you encourage your students to sort of adopt that same sort of idea through their responses and how they turn in assignments?
I can give an example. Right now, I'm teaching Intro to Professional Writing, which is English 204. And that course enrolls students from across the institution. Most of our students in that course are not English majors. So they could be psychology, education, they could be engineering, they could be in business. And I have those students doing all sorts of different modalities throughout the course. So the assignment that they're turning in right now, they're doing a usability analysis of a Wikipedia page that is covering some sort of content related to their own field of study. They have to turn in a plan to do the analysis, and they have to turn in 2 Zoom videos of moderated remote usability analysis sessions. So they have to have a peer come in and have that peer use the Wikipedia content, and they record them, and the peer shares their screen, and you can see everything the peer's doing with the content. And then they record those and they submit those videos along with their memo. This week, they're going to write a report based on that. What did we learn? Is Wikipedia useful? What could be different? What features of Wikipedia really help users find content that they're looking for, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next assignment they're going to do is they're going to write for Wikipedia. So they're going to actually compose an article in Wikipedia and submit it to Wikipedia based on what's called a stub. Wikipedia community determines what content needs to be included. And so they have a page, a listing of what they call stubs. So these are all things like we already approved that this topic should exist, that there should be a page on this topic, there should be a page on this topic. And then if you locate that list of stubs, you know that you can submit content to that space and they will not just take it down. Unlike what most people think, you can't just go in Wikipedia and just start submitting random content. Right. It's not so easy as that. You have to actually, if you're going to submit a brand new page, that topic needs to be approved by a higher level of user of the online encyclopedia to say, yes, this should exist. Well, stubs are things that the online organizing groups have already determined should exist.
That's super interesting. I love how you tailor it to the student's interest as well, because and that project in general, I think, is very practical, because a lot of that is work that if they're working in the sciences, they'll have to be doing work that is very similar to that, and like vetting their sources and then trying to get things published. It really does mirror the process of what they'll face on the other end, which I think that's really brilliant. I love that.
Well, and one of the things you get to do when you submit content to Wikipedia now, it's become actually kind of more what we call WYSIWYG, right? What you see is what you get. But you used to have to actually know some rudimentary tags in order to, for example, insert a link or make something bold, or you had to write a little bit of like Wikipedia-oriented code, almost like HTML, but more like Markdown, like very stripped down tagging. And it gives people a light introduction to the concept of you tag in this kind of environment and there's an output that the user sees that doesn't include those tags but is part of the experience. And that is something that is useful to learn, that separation between form and content and format and content.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. So I'm going to move into other classes that you teach. You spend most of your time teaching in the science and medical writing spaces, and you oversee a program that sets up graduate students with a medical writing internship at the local hospital here in Wilmington. Can you talk a little bit about that program, how that started, and what the students go through?
I was asked to do a presentation for NC State for their little conference, or asked to at least submit an abstract for that. And I determined to talk about the medical writing internship, and I called it the accidental internship. I didn't mean to begin that internship. I was just contacted by somebody at the hospital who said that they wanted graduate students to come and help with their residents' writing. So either edit, copy edit, or actually what they really wanted was for people to help them do some of the writing. But they weren't really prepared to pay them.
Right. Of course.
And so knowing that, I said, well, we could try an internship format where the student would get credit, they would get an educational experience, and then you would also get the assistance that you need with the residents and the medical faculty's writing. And so that's what we did. And it's kind of evolved since we began it in, I think it was 2017. It evolved into a much more systematized kind of experience. The students get all kinds of certifications that allow them to be prepared to do research in clinical settings in terms of dealing with human subjects and being ethical in terms of working with sensitive medical information. They have done everything from copy editing to making posters to making flyers to actually writing, helping the residents write their research and create, actually do some of the writing themselves. And some of them have been credited on the papers that have been published in medical journals.
Yeah, that's awesome, especially if you're trying to, as a student, one day get into professional medical writing. When you go into the job, you can already point to places where you're like, I've already been published. That is really a great experience. In the last couple of years, maybe in the last 10 years, I feel like the field of professional writing within the English departments has really exploded. I feel like it wasn't as focused on before. And I feel like this is in reaction to the need to make the English department more relevant. If we're trying to prove that you can get a job other than just teaching English at a high school level at the other end of your degree. Do you think that this more widespread adoption of professional writing, like technical writing, science writing, medical writing, is helping to relevate the English department?
We really have to back up if we are going to think about professional and technical writing as an academic discipline, either within the English department or as a separate department. Its evolution really began in the 80s. Really, we had technical writing and business writing. They kind of came together as professional writing in the 1990s. Purdue's track in their rhetoric and composition program in professional and technical writing was begun in the 90s, maybe even a little bit before in the late 80s. So this is something that's been going on for a long time. People have needed to write better in organizational contexts for a long time. People have needed to learn how to use writing and communication technologies more effectively for a long time. So this is nothing new. Our department, the Department of English at UNCW, did not decide to include professional writing necessarily because they wanted their students to get different sorts of jobs, but it does provide a different avenue for students to use their interest in language and writing, analysis and critical thinking and all of the things that you do in literary studies to also do that in organizational contexts. And I do think that it is a different kind of employment pathway. Certainly, we started the certificate at the post-baccalaureate certificate in science and medical writing directly as a professional credential. But that was targeting people who were already in workplace contexts. We were not targeting current students. Mm-hmm. We were targeting people who were already out in the community working in different places and wanted another credential in order to maybe direct their career in an alternate way.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like nowadays you probably see a lot more undergraduate students that would be interested in those certificates.
Well, the way in which the general decline in student interest in all humanities disciplines has affected us as well. In the early 2000s, we had the largest undergraduate program in professional and technical writing in the country in terms of student numbers. We had at one point over 120 majors in professional writing.
Wow,
at UNCW.
Know that. I did not know that.
Nobody knows that.
Yeah, wow. Well, now they do because it's been recorded on this podcast.
And that was with almost no advertising.
Huh.
It just happened.
Yeah.
But after the financial crisis and the focus shifting to, kind of looking at education more instrumentally and looking at things that people could envision as direct pathways to particular jobs, like go to school, get a degree in accounting, be an accountant, which is a great profession if that's what you're into. But it's not the same in professional and technical writing. You could be a technical writer, but you could also be a content curator. You could be an information manager. You could do so many things that it's not this direct pathway where the name of your degree is then also the name of your job. It's not always like that. And so it takes a little bit more marketing and information sharing to help people understand what they would get out of the degree.
Right. Yeah, I've talked to, I think every faculty member that I've had on the podcast so far, we've talked about this as if we could put one hyper-specific problem to the English departments, it is the intangibility of the end goal. When you're done with your degree, what job do you get? Which maybe not every other, but most of the other majors, when you're done, you know what you're going to do. And that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast is hopefully if a large listener body listens to this, they will hopefully come to realize how many options there are at the end of an English degree. It's not nearly as limited as they think that it is.
Absolutely. And you can make your own path. It can lead you to being an entrepreneur. It can lead you to, working in writing in some capacity or in editing in some capacity for an established organization, or it can lead you to thinking about different kinds of technologies in different ways and working in a very high-tech kind of field.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember her name right now, but for a while, the chief project manager at YouTube was a English major. She had graduated from whatever school with, I think, a master's of English, and she ended up getting a job at YouTube right as YouTube was starting up and worked there for a very long time, making very good money. It's like that. Those are things that you can do with an English degree. Is like creative project management is a really big job, and working at there's a lot of jobs you can work in tech that you wouldn't think. You're like, oh, I don't know how to code, so I can never work in tech. But that's really not true because they need all sorts of jobs in those companies.
And if we're doing our job correctly, at least in professional writing, our students should know a bit about how to code. And they should know...
Sure. Because that's just another type of writing. It's another language. Yeah.
They should know how to edit visuals. They should know how to edit audio. They should know how to put all of these modalities together in a project and make something. They should be learning all of that. And I think we try hard to give them that range of experience, and I hope that they take it, because that really does prepare you for doing a lot of different things in workplace context.
Yeah. There's a Inside Higher Ed article that I've quoted on this show before, so apologies to the listeners who's heard this quote a million times. But it's called Virtuous Arguments, and it's by John Duffy, and he proposes that college writing courses represent, and I'll quote here, one of the few places in the academic curriculum where students learn the basics of an argument, how to provide evidence, and how to consider alternative points of view. He argues that within these college writing courses, and he is specifically talking about English like 101 writing, intro to college writing, but I think that it applies to professional writing courses as well. He argues that these courses can, as a society, cultivate a greater capacity for compassion and help improve the state of the country's public discourse. And I think that as someone who teaches writing at the university, I was wondering, how do you encourage personal and professional growth in your students and a more amicable public discourse?
Well, I mean, I teach science writing to a lot of scientists, and I think in that work you see kind of the most direct answer to this sort of question. One of the things that we are constantly struggling with in those classes is, how do you express your scientific research to a wider audience and get them to be both interested and caring about it, and also understand it and be able to use the technical information that you have to help them with whatever they're concerned about related to the environment or medicine or chemistry or biochemistry or clinical research. So it can be all these different fields, and how do you make that information interesting, accessible, and helpful, and work with people who may be skeptical of some of the information that you're providing, and how do you persuade them to think maybe a little bit differently about the content that you have?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic did a lot of things for society, but it certainly taught us that medical writing was very, very important, because the messaging around everything that was going on through the pandemic just hit home that we need to be able to very effectively convey technical and medical information in a way that doesn't seem political, that doesn't seem scary, that seems very helpful. And so your courses, I'm sure, are helping to make that, a better world.
And I try to convince my students in science writing that you have to sort of change your perspective, in that you don't want to start out with the deficit model of scientific communication in terms of conveying ideas to larger publics. If you could just explain it more clearly, they would just believe you. That's not going to work. Mm-hmm. You need to have more evidence, and you also need to put yourself in the position of your audience. That's maybe where the empathy comes in, and think about how they would be perceiving and receiving that information and what their needs are, and how to tap into those needs in terms of telling them what it is that you're doing and why it's important.
So I want to talk about your personal research as well. Recently, you've been focusing on privacy and surveillance in electronic spaces. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been learning there? And then also, I feel like not many people would think of this as something that would fit within the study of English or the humanities. So can you explain how that research fits within this department and this study?
So anytime you access web pages or any digital content, you're leaving information for the provider of that content to use for their own ends. Basically, we think that we are accessing information online and that we are the receiver, we are the client, but we are not. We are the product. And the companies are marketing us to their advertisers. So when you move from website to website, some commercial, some not commercial, you're being tracked that whole time. So anytime you're searching for information, anytime you're interacting with content in digital spaces, you're also participating in that marketing enterprise. And so it's very relevant for people in English and people in writing, because where else are you getting the content? So you can't help but become part of that enterprise of, marketing users to prospective advertisers, because that's what happens.
Yeah.
And most people don't know it's happening. They don't see it's happening. And so one of the things that I work on with students is just making the tracking visual. And so we use, you can use a number of different apps. Like there's one called Ghostery, where you can make visual all of the tracking that's happening as you move from site to site. It's called Tracking the Trackers, right? So you can see the number of different organizations that are collecting data about you and the ways in which you are interacting with various sites as you move from one website to another. And just because you leave, let's say you go to a commerce-oriented site, just because you leave that site doesn't mean that the site stopped tracking you. It tracks you after it.
That's wild.
There are laws in the world. So the European Union has a law, the GDPR, which protects users to some degree from that amount of tracking. It also does things like allow young people to have the right to be forgotten. So, people do maybe ill-conceived activities online when they're young, and then they have regret over those activities when they get older, and maybe they're even preventing them from moving forward in their careers, or from getting rid of some of that baggage, right, that maybe was not something they would have chosen to do if they had been older.
Right.
So the European Union has the right to be forgotten, and you can petition all of these data brokers, and they have to remove all of your information.
Huh. Yeah, that's amazing. I'd never heard of any of that. That's something that I had thought about before on the internet, especially with TikTok and with social media the way that it is. Social media didn't really start to blow up until I was in high school, probably later in high school too. But you look now, and kids' whole lives are on the internet. It's all on Instagram. It's all on Snapchat. It's all on Facebook. And also, as you grow, you go through different phases, and you get embarrassed about the phases that you were in before. And you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that my emo phase is all over Instagram, and it will never go away. And that's a really tame version about that, because also if you engage in any sort of activity or chat rooms or whatever, that then you realize that, I'm not very proud of the person that I was 6 months ago, person I was a year ago, but now that stuff is there forever. And I think that is so terrifying. As I have 2 daughters, and my daughters are very, very young, but they're growing up in a very different world than I grew up in. When I was a child, I wasn't worried about the internet tracking everything that I was Googling, because even then, we didn't even always Google at that point. Sometimes we were using other things. It is a completely different world now, and it is scary.
Yeah, digital communications are forever, and anything that you put out there on email or on all those social media sites can be found and is findable. So that gives people a big burden, as you're saying, to own every single thing they did. And maybe they weren't really mature enough to know the consequences from a long-term perspective, because they were literally a child.
Right.
That, it's not just being paternalistic and saying college students are mature. No, we're talking actual children
right.
who really maybe didn't know what would happen later on, because how could you even conceive of what could happen later with this content? That's why digital privacy is so important. And it puts everyone at risk of things like identity theft. And these things are something that individuals then are tasked with the burden of fixing. So if your identity is stolen, if your personal data is compromised, the companies that could have protected you more are not on the hook for protecting you. It's you who have to pick up the pieces and spend hours on the phone trying to get things recovered, or trying to cancel things like credit cards or other information, and change things, freeze your credit, all of these kinds of things. This is all up to the individual. So we've given individuals the burden of fixing things when they go wrong, and the burden of also trying to protect their own privacy when that's not possible.
Right.
The balance is so unequal because you've got major corporations with all the information and funding and know-how, and you've got individual users. And so it just isn't a balanced situation where people really can, even if you take all the advice that's out there online about how to protect your privacy and how to make sure that your information is not compromised, even if you do all the things right, it can still happen to you.
Yeah.
And we don't really have a good mechanism for any kind of redress for people who are harmed in these situations. And so that's why I'm very interested in it. It's from an ethical perspective, but it's also an impossibility to do work in current environments without touching all of the content that's online, to do any kind of research or writing or investigations. You can't do that without engaging with digital spaces. And those spaces are inherently unsafe in some ways.
Yeah. I was having a conversation with somebody recently where I was talking about how our job as literary critics is to point out problems that we see in the world and then research them and then talk about them. And so, like I said, people might be surprised that this is something that is being written about within the humanities department. And I just think that it's exactly the sorts of things that should be written within the humanities department, because I view us as the judicial branch of humanity, basically, where we are the ones who look at what is being done, what has been written into legislation of existence, and then pointing out the flaws and being like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. And I think that that's exactly what your research is doing. So I applaud you for that.
And I don't know how much of a difference it's making, but I'm definitely trying.
That's good. I'm glad you are. Has anything really surprised you while you've been doing this research?
I'm always finding new ways in which people's information can be compromised that, you didn't think of before. So that's often surprising. It's kind of a game of whack-a-mole, right? Where you're like, anything you shut down, there's like another avenue for things to get out over here. And so it's constant shifting. And no matter what you do to try to tamp down on your exposure, people will find another way to expose you. So that maybe, the tenacity maybe hasn't surprised me, but it's impressive.
Yeah, sure. What inspired you to pursue a degree in the humanities in the first place? Let's take it all the way back to the beginning.
Well, I didn't. I began my higher education as a double major in English and chemistry, and I was going to be a medical doctor.
Oh, interesting. And here you are. You became a doctor in a different aspect.
Exactly.
That's great.
I loved chemistry, but I really wanted to study English, and I was happy that I could do both. From the beginning, I had jobs where I did both, like in between semesters in my college and then graduate school. I had jobs where I was either being a chemist and running samples, or I had a job once where I was a chemist in the morning and a writer of reports in the afternoon. So I did the science and then I wrote up the science. So I got to do both things. And I've always appreciated both. And I'm glad that now I'm able to teach scientific writing and medical writing. And that allows me again to kind of pursue all the interests. I always tell students, like, you never know what you're going to get out of something that you learn or a class that you take or an experience that you have. And so you should be open to all of it, because it will come back and help you in some way that you didn't consider when you first did it. Try to always be open to new experiences, new information, new disciplines, and see what you can leverage from that to help you in some other future endeavor.
Yeah, nice. What gives you hope right now for the future of the humanities?
Well, I'm excited that we do still have students and faculty and other people, people who are writing books for popular consumption, who are obviously still committed to helping the humanities to stay vibrant and interesting and helpful to everyone. So I guess interest of a variety of different groups makes me feel somewhat hopeful.
What's the best book that you've read recently?
So there's a couple. Our Missing Hearts I read recently. Celeste Ng, and she's the same person who wrote Little Fires Everywhere. Mm-hmm. And she's amazing. She actually is also from near where I grew up. She's from Shaker Heights, and I grew up in a town called Mentor, Ohio. If you grew up in Mentor, you say mentor. You don't say mentor, but no one will know what you're talking about if I don't say mentor. So I also, from a science writing perspective, The Secret of Life, which is about the development of DNA and the contributions of Rosalind Franklin, who was... her contributions to the development of DNA were not widely known and celebrated, and actually kind of downplayed, especially in her lifetime.
Right.
Fascinating book.
Dr. Reilly, thank you so much for coming on the show.
You are so welcome. Very nice to talk to you today.
Relevate is produced each week by Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Today's episode was hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Dana Charles Wright, and executive produced by Dr. Megan Sweeney. Special thanks to Randall Library and the excellent people at the Digital Makerspace for lending us their studio. If you have a project, a paper, or a topic that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, and you're a faculty member or a student of an accredited college or university, please send us an email at relevatepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.